Rain fell like a wounded sky, soft at first, then desperate, pressing against the cracked sidewalks as though it wanted to be let inside the world. Streetlights flickered, trembling in their own tired reflections, and water gathered in trembling silver ribbons along the curb. A small, nearly forgotten salon breathed weakly between a closed pharmacy and a darkened tailor's shop, its window fogged with the warmth of human breath and the smell of aging chemicals. Inside, a young woman sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her long, dark hair cascading down her back like a final, fragile memory of something beautiful she could no longer afford to keep. The scissors rested in the stylist's fingers, cold, hesitant, as though they, too, understood what was about to be lost. The first cut came like a whisper, almost gentle, a soft, feathery sound, a tiny surrender. Locks fell silently onto the tiled floor, pooling like fallen petals, like pieces of a dream she had once carried quietly inside her chest. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now let's begin. Her name was Amara, and she did not cry when the scissors closed again. She did not flinch when more of her hair slipped away. She had learned over too many winters and too many empty cupboards that tears were a luxury she could not afford. Outside, the storm deepened, and across the street, hidden behind the tinted windows of a black silent car, a man watched. He rested in the back seat, posture still, presence heavy. To the city, he was a ghost wrapped in silk and shadow. To the underworld, his name was spoken like a prayer made in fear. Armen Valles did not often look at small, ordinary people. They did not exist in the corridors of power where men like him walked. Yet tonight, his eyes did not wander. They stayed fixed on the foggy salon window, on the blurred outline of a girl surrendering something precious without complaint. He had noticed her earlier that day when she stood outside a small, dim grocery store, counting coins in her shaking palm. He had not known why he slowed his car then. He had only known that there was something about the way she stood. Straight-backed, shoulders tired, refusing to look pitiful, that anchored him. Now as he watched the hair fall in soft, irreversible waves, something unfamiliar stirred beneath the calm discipline of his face. It was not pity. He despised pity. It was something quieter, something more dangerous. Inside the salon, the air smelled of damp wool coats and old magazines. The stylist worked in silence now, understanding there were no words worth offering. Each snip was clean, final. Amara closed her eyes for one small moment, not because she wanted to escape, but because she wanted to remember the feeling of weight at her back, the warmth of childhood mornings when her mother braided her hair slowly, tenderly. That life belonged to another girl. Not this one. When it was over, the stylist gathered the thick, bundled strands like a sacred offering and placed them in a simple envelope. Amara held it carefully, like one might hold a fragile, living thing. Her reflection stared back at her from the cracked mirror, thinner somehow, more exposed. Her neck looked longer. The world suddenly felt colder without the curtain of the hair to protect her. She paid with a soft nod instead of words. Thank you lived behind her lips but never crossed them. Gratitude in her world felt like an indulgence. Outside, the rain kissed her bare skin as she stepped into it. It slid down her coat, found the nervous tremble in her fingers. She hugged the envelope to her chest and walked quickly, careful not to run, careful not to look desperate. Dignity was the last thing she owned. Armen's driver shifted slightly, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir?" he asked quietly. "Follow," Armen replied, his voice low, a quiet command that did not need force. The car moved like a shadow, careful, silent, respectful of the distance. Amara walked past glowing shop windows that displayed things she could not imagine owning. Shoes, warm jackets, soft blankets in warm, safe colors. She did not look at them. Her path was narrow. Her purpose small, but urgent. A narrow dairy shop glowed faintly on the corner, its flickering neon sign painting everything in weak blue light. She entered, bell ringing softly above the door. The shopkeeper barely looked up. She placed the envelope on the counter, and the man behind it understood without questions. Hair had become currency for women like her. Desperation had its own economy. Moments later, she stepped back into the rain holding a small paper bag like a treasure. Inside was milk. Warm, fresh, real. In the car, Armand felt something tighten inside his chest. Something he had long ago buried beneath logic and violence and control. He had ordered men's lives ended without the shake of a hand, without the flicker of doubt. Yet the sight of her cradling that small bag of milk as though it were gold cracked something silent and old within him. She paused under the broken awning of the shop, lifting her face slightly toward the rain. A single drop slid along her cheek, like something that almost tried to be a tear. She did not notice the expensive black car idling across the street. She did not feel the eyes resting gently, dangerously, upon her small silhouette. Armand folded his fingers together. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was passing. He told himself he would forget her by morning. But as she turned and disappeared down a narrow alley, fragile and stubborn and real, he already knew he was lying. The storm softened for a moment, as though the sky itself was holding its breath. And somewhere between falling rain and quiet breath, the first thread of destiny stretched, invisible, delicate, and impossible to break. The milk was still warm when Amara reached the narrow stairwell that smelled of old paint, boiled rice, and the quiet sorrow of too many lives folded into too little space. The bulb above the entrance flickered as she pushed the door open with her shoulder, careful not to let the rain touch the paper bag. Every step upward creaked beneath her weight, each one a small promise that she would not slip, that she would not falter, that she would make it upstairs before the warmth faded. The room was barely a room at all. One window, one sink, one bed that doubled as a chair and sometimes as a table. A small electric stove sat in the corner, its surface scratched and darkened by years of desperate use. On the bed lay her younger brother, tucked beneath a thin blanket, his breathing shallow, his eyelashes trembling faintly with fever. Amara moved quietly. She always moved quietly, as though silence itself was a kind of protection. She poured the milk into a chipped cup, her hands steady despite the cold that had settled in her bones. Coins lay scattered on the tiny shelf beside the stove, arranged in tired little stacks, each one counted, recounted, and cherished like a fragile miracle. Her entire life had become a discipline of calculation. How much for electricity? How much for bread? How much for medicine that never seemed to last? She did not remember the feeling of buying something without first calculating what it might cost her tomorrow. She lifted Eli's head gently and held the cup to his lips. His eyes fluttered open, foggy and distant. He did not ask where the milk came from. He never did. Children like him learn quickly not to ask questions they could not afford to hear answered. Slowly, she whispered, voice soft as candle smoke. He drank. Color returned to his face like the faintest hint of morning. Across the city, the rain washed over towering buildings of glass and steel. Light spilled from penthouse windows where laughter sometimes lived carefully, politely. Armand stood alone by a wide window that overlooked everything and nothing. His coat had not yet been removed. The city lights reflected in the glass, fractured and restless. On a polished table behind him lay files, documents, maps of deals that moved like hidden rivers beneath the city's surface. Men feared his signature more than storms. His name did not appear in newspapers. It passed in whispers, in late-night phone calls, in quiet agreements that ruined or rescued lives without sound. Yet his mind did not return to any of it. It stayed on a girl with rain on her lashes and a paper bag of milk held like a sacred thing. He poured himself a drink and did not raise it to his lips. Money had never felt like weight to him. It had always been distance, an emptiness so wide it could not be crossed. But tonight, he thought of coins laid carefully on a shelf. He thought of fingers counting them, of the cost of warmth. He did not understand why that mattered. The next day arrived grey and unpromising. Amara walked to the small factory where she folded cardboard boxes for pennies that bit like cold teeth. Her hands moved quickly, expertly. The room smelled of glue and dust and work that did not love you back. The other women barely spoke. Words, too, were expensive. She ate a small piece of dry bread for lunch. Outside, the clouds hung low and tired. The world did not feel cruel. It felt indifferent, which was sometimes worse. In a black car parked half a block away, tinted windows hid a man who had no reason to be there. Armin watched the factory entrance with a patience he had never shown when waiting for enemies or negotiations. He had ordered a background report before sunrise. Not out of strategy, not out of danger, out of something he wouldn't name. The paper had told him everything. Orphaned at 17, caregiver to a sick brother, no debts beyond survival, no connections, no protection. Invisible. A man like him was never invisible. He was followed, feared, worshipped in secret. Yet he had never felt more seen than when his eyes tracked the small, tired line of her shoulders as she stepped outside for air, resting one hand against the wall just long enough to gather herself before going back in. He let his driver hand a folded envelope to a courier that afternoon. No names, no trace. Just instructions to leave it by the landlord's door. Inside the envelope were bills that could have bought her months of relief. He told himself it was charity. He told himself it was boredom. He knew it was neither. That night, Amara found the envelope. She stared at it for a long time, heart beating too loudly for the small room to hold. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The money looked unreal, like paper that belonged to another life. She counted it. Once, twice. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply sat on the floor and tried to breathe around the sudden, overwhelming silence of possibility. Who would leave money like this? There was no name. No note. Only the sound of Eli coughing softly in the background, a reminder of what this kindness could buy. She used some of it for medicine. She paid part of the rent. She bought bread that was soft for the first time in months. With every purchase, she felt both gratitude and suspicion blooming side by side like two flowers forced to share the same soil. On a rooftop far above, Armand lit a cigarette he did not need. He watched the city lights blink alive. He imagined her small room, the cracked sink, the thin blanket, the milk. He did not understand why her life had slipped so quietly into his thoughts. But he did understand one thing with brutal clarity. He did not want her suffering to be invisible anymore. And somewhere deep in the heartbeat of the city, coins continued to be counted, rain continued to fall, and a dangerous man began to care about something that could not be controlled. The envelope continued to exist in Amara's life like a quiet ghost. Folded carefully and hidden, beneath the thin mattress, it slept close to the warmth of her body every night, as if it were a fragile promise she was afraid to touch too often. She did not spend it recklessly. She spent it like someone afraid it might vanish if she breathed too hard. Only what was necessary. Only what kept Eli breathing peacefully through the night. For a while, she almost believed it had been a miracle that required no meaning. Almost. The first time she felt the shift in the air was on a pale, tired afternoon. The sky hung in soft grey sheets, too heavy to rain, too sad to clear. She had just left the factory, her hands smelling of glue and cardboard dust, her shoulders aching from hours of silent repetition. The city felt muted, as if all sound had been dipped in cotton. She waited at the bus stop, clutching her worn bag close to her chest. The glass shelter trembled lightly in the wind. She stared at her reflection, noticing how different she looked now. Hair short, neck exposed, a stranger in her own skin. A black car rolled slowly to a stop across the street. She did not notice it at first. She was thinking about Eli's fever, about whether to buy eggs tomorrow or save the money for rent. The car felt like just another shadow in a city full of them. But inside that car, Armin felt something tighten. He had not planned to stop. He had not even realized he had been nearby. It had just happened, like a small betrayal of instinct. There she was, framed by dull glass and tired metal, alive in a way that made the world outside the tinted window feel unreal. He lowered the window just an inch, enough to let the city breathe inside, enough to see her more clearly. A gust of wind lifted the edge of her coat. She hugged herself lightly, stepping back as a bus rushed past and sprayed water against the curb. She flinched, and her eyes lifted for the first time. They met his. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was soft and terrible. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. She saw a man she did not recognize, dark-eyed, still, impossibly calm. She did not know his name. She did not know the language of danger that wrapped itself around him like an expensive coat. She only felt the strange, unsettling sensation of being seen in a way she had never been seen before. Not as weak, not as invisible, just seen. Armin felt the same shock in reverse. He had expected curiosity, distance, the safety of glass. He had not expected the quiet strength in her gaze. He had not expected the softness that felt like a question he could not answer. The bus arrived with a tired hiss. She broke the stair first, stepping inside. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. Life moved forward again, but something had crossed. That night, Amara found it harder to sleep. The room felt smaller. The ceiling felt lower. The world felt wider. She kept seeing the man's face in her mind, not sharply, but like a reflection in rainwater. Not fear, not comfort. Something in between. Why had he looked at her like that? Across the city, Armin sat in his office, fingers folded, lights low. The room smelled of leather and old paper. A single lamp cast long shadows over the walls that had heard too many secrets to ever forget. He told himself it had been nothing. A chance glance, a passing storm. He told himself he had never let a stranger's eyes follow him into the quiet corners of his thoughts before. The next crossing was quieter. Days later, Amara stopped at the small corner shop to buy bread and a little fruit for Eli. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped inside. The shop was narrow and worn, but warm. It smelled of sugar and dust and old wood. She reached for a loaf wrapped in thin paper when she felt the change in the air again. Someone stood behind her, not close enough to touch, not far enough to ignore. She turned slightly, expecting a tired man or a distracted woman. Instead, she found herself facing familiar, dark eyes. This time, there was no glass between them. "I'm sorry," she said instinctively, even though she had done nothing wrong. Armin inclined his head just a fraction. "After you," he replied, his voice low, smooth, controlled. His accent was hard to place, not local, not distant. It wrapped around his words like quiet authority. She nodded and stepped back. Their hands brushed for the briefest second when he reached for a wrapped chocolate bar near the counter. The contact was accidental, harmless. yet it felt like the start of something she could not explain. She felt warmth spread through her fingers. He felt the same, and he hated himself for noticing. At the counter, he placed a quiet bill down before the shopkeeper could speak. "Add her items as well," he said, softly. Amara's eyes widened. "You don't have to." "It's nothing," he replied without looking at her. But it was not nothing. She hesitated, then allowed it, because arguing would only make the moment heavier. When she stepped outside, carrying the bag of bread and fruit, she stopped under the narrow awning. "Thank you," she said, finally meeting his eyes again. "For what?" he asked. "For not making it feel like charity." Something shifted in him at that, something delicate and terrifying. He gave a small nod, as if accepting a truth he had not meant to touch. They walked in opposite directions after that. No promises, no names, no explanations. Just a crossing of two lives that had never been meant to align. Later, as she walked through the fading light, Amara felt the world shimmer faintly at the edges. She did not know she had just brushed against danger. She did not know she had stepped into the story of a man who did not belong to soft things. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, her heart felt like it had been gently tapped, as though someone had knocked quietly and then walked away. From the far end of the street, Armin paused and looked back once. She did not turn, but the air between them remained fragile as glass. And somewhere beneath the city's restless breath, the first crossing lingered, unfinished, unanswered, and quietly impossible to undo. The nights grew quieter, but the quiet was heavier now. Amara began to notice how silence had changed inside her small room. It no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, as if something invisible sat gently beside her while she washed dishes or folded Eli's worn clothes. It was a soft disturbance, like a breeze through curtains that had not moved in years. She kept thinking of the man's eyes, not his face, not his posture, not the way his coat had forgotten what dust felt like, just his eyes. They had not judged her. They had not softened with pity. They had simply stayed, still and steady, like they had found something familiar in her that he was not ready to understand. She began to write again. It happened without decision. One evening, after Eli fell asleep and the bulb flickered into its tired yellow circle of light, she found a half-used notebook in the bottom of a drawer. The pages smelled faintly of old paper and forgotten intentions. She opened it slowly, touching the empty page as if it might be fragile. She had once dreamed of being a writer. A small dream, a private one, the kind that lived quietly in her chest and died slowly over time. But that night, she picked up a pen and began to write. She wrote to no one. She wrote about rain and scissors and small paper bags of milk. She wrote about a bus stop and tinted windows and a stranger's eyes. She wrote about loneliness that wasn't loud, but deep enough to make breathing careful. She wrote letters that had no address. She folded the pages afterward and tucked them inside the notebook, too afraid to throw them away, too afraid to let anyone read them. They became a secret garden inside her life, a place where she could breathe fully without being watched. Across the city, Armand stood in a room that had too many windows and no warmth. He held no pen, kept no notebooks. His life was written in transactions, coded calls, and silent agreements. Yet lately, his thoughts were wandering into places that did not belong to men like him. He found himself remembering small details he had never trained himself to remember. The curve of her fingers around the bag of bread, the way she had said thank you without shame, the soft firmness in her voice when she had spoken. He never asked his people to learn her schedule. He never demanded her location be tracked. That would have turned her into something else, something trapped. He only watched from a distance, occasionally, carefully, as if proximity might contaminate something pure. One evening, he found himself holding a piece of expensive stationery he had not meant to touch. It was absurd. He sat at his wide, polished desk, city lights burning low in the distance, and stared at the empty page before him. He told himself he would write nothing. He told himself this was a foolish indulgence. He told himself he would tear it up. His hand moved anyway. He wrote about rain falling against glass. That surprised him. He had not known he remembered that kind of sound. He wrote about hands that were small but strong, about silence that felt like a language he once understood. He did not write her name. He did not even know her name. He folded the paper slowly. He did not send it anywhere. He locked it inside a drawer that had never held softness before. The days passed in their disciplined rhythm, and something invisible stretched stronger between them without either of them touching it. Amara started noticing small things. A bag of groceries left near the door when she returned from work. A brown envelope slipped under the floor of the stairwell with no name and no sound. Medicine appearing quietly at the pharmacy counter already paid for, the cashier only shrugging when she asked. She did not connect it fully to the man yet, not consciously. But the thought moved near the surface of her heart and rested there, soft as breath fogging glass. She began writing to him without knowing she was. In her notebook, she described eyes she couldn't forget. She wondered who he was, what storms had made such calm possible. She asked questions she knew would never be answered. "Do you feel lonely?" she wrote once. "Do you know what kindness costs?" She folded those pages carefully, as if they might bruise. Armand, meanwhile, began to notice when she didn't appear at familiar corners. The absence of her shape in the world started to feel louder than her presence. When she did appear, stepping off buses or walking home, he felt a strange quietness settle inside him, a tension released without sound. He began to leave smaller things, not money, not always. Sometimes it was a scarf placed gently over a railing near the factory entrance on cold mornings. Sometimes it was a cup of tea, ordered and paid for, left untouched on a cafe table along her path. He never watched her receive them. That mattered. He wanted no gratitude, no fear, only safety. One late afternoon, Amara found a folded piece of paper on the corner of her narrow kitchen shelf. It was blank. She stared at it for a long time. The blankness felt heavier than words. She sat at the table and placed her notebook beside it. Her fingers hovered above the paper, then stopped. She folded it again and placed it carefully back where she had found it. Some things felt too fragile to disturb. That night, rain returned softly. Not a storm, not a warning. Just a steady, patient fall that made the city feel like it was being washed clean of invisible dust. Amara lay beside Eli, listening to his quiet breath. She pressed her palm lightly against her chest, feeling her heart beat gently beneath it. In another part of the city, Armand stood without his jacket, the skyline breathing through the glass before him. He rested his knuckles lightly against the cool surface of the window. Neither of them slept quickly. Neither of them understood what was happening. But somewhere between pages never mailed and words never spoken, something fragile and dangerous was growing. A story written in silence, sealed in envelopes that never left their hands. Winter arrived quietly, not with storms, but with a slow, creeping cold that slipped through cracks in walls and settled into bones. The air grew thinner, sharper. Breath began to show itself in faint, white ghosts. The city moved differently in winter, shoulders hunched, voices softer, footsteps quicker, as if everyone were trying to outrun the loneliness that drifted like fog. Amara felt it first in her hands. They ached when she folded cardboard at the factory. They trembled slightly when she washed plates in cold water. The small heater in their room worked only when electricity was kind, and kindness, like everything else, was not guaranteed. Still, Eli slept more peacefully now. The medicine helped. The milk came more often. The cough softened into something that sounded less like breaking. Warmth had started to exist in borrowed pieces. One evening, as the sky darkened too early and wind scraped against the city like restless fingers, Amara returned home to find a wrapped parcel resting against their door. It was small, carefully placed, tied with plain string. She stood over it for a long moment, heart tightening. No name, no sound, no footsteps echoing down the stairwell. Inside was a blanket, not expensive, not fancy, but thick, soft, warm. The kind of warmth she remembered from a childhood that felt distant and dreamlike. She pressed it to her face before she realized what she was doing. It smelled faintly of clean fabric and something simpler. Home. She didn't cry. She laid it gently over Eli that night, watching his breathing slow, watching his fingers curl into the soft edge of it, as if his body remembered safety. From the shadow of a car parked down the street, Harmon counted the lights in her window. He sat with his coat pulled tighter around his shoulders, though he didn't feel cold. He hadn't sent anyone, hadn't ordered this. He had done it himself. He told himself it was more efficient that way, less trace, less noise. He watched the faint yellow glow flicker behind the thin curtains. He imagined the room, the chipped cup, the cracked sink, the bed too small for dreams. He wasn't used to this kind of watching. When he watched before, it was to plan, to calculate, to study weakness. This watching was quieter. It had no reward. And yet, he couldn't leave. Days turned into weeks, and warmth began to arrive in quiet forms. A bag of firewood appearing beside the building on particularly bitter nights. A bag of coal left by the stairwell. A scarf draped carefully over the back of a chair in the factory's break room, folded as though someone had touched it with respect. Amara noticed everything. She began to understand that there was a pattern. Every time the cold deepened, something warm found its way into her life. Every time Eli's breathing turned rough in the night, medicine appeared quietly at the pharmacy counter the next morning. She started calling it, in her heart, borrowed warmth. Not earned, not demanded, simply borrowed from someone she could not see. Her notebook filled with new words. She wrote about gloves resting on metal railings, about blankets folded too carefully, about the feeling of warmth arriving just before despair had time to settle. "Are you real?" she wrote once, the pen trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." She folded those pages tightly. Across the city, Armand found himself standing in a store he'd never entered before. A small, narrow place that smelled of wool and old books. He felt out of place beneath the low ceiling and flickering light. He picked up gloves without knowing a woman's size, choosing them by instinct. The shopkeeper looked at him strangely. Men like Armand did not belong in places like this. But he didn't care. He carried warmth in a paper bag and left it behind her work one cold morning, careful not to be seen. That day, when Amara found the gloves, she held them for a long time. Her fingers slid inside, and for the first time in weeks, they didn't shake. She walked home slowly, her hands in someone else's kindness. Her fear began to grow alongside her gratitude. Who did this without wanting praise? Who watched without demanding recognition? That night, she stood by the small, fogged window of their room after Eli had fallen asleep. The city lights shimmered faintly through the mist. Somewhere out there, cars moved softly, lives crossed. Stories began and ended without sound. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and whispered into the quiet room. Not for the walls, not for Eli, but for the invisible space beyond the glass. Just Be careful. She didn't know who she was talking to. He heard it anyway, because that night Armin paused beneath the streetlight across from the building. He stood in shadow, one hand in his coat pocket, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. He lifted his eyes to the window. The curtain trembled slightly. He felt the tightening in his chest again. That quiet, dangerous emotion that had no place in his world. He had spent a lifetime stealing warmth away from others, hardening himself against softness. Now he was trying to give warmth to someone he had never touched. One evening, their worlds moved closer without warning. Amara entered a small cafe to escape the worst of the wind. Fogged glass, low lights, the gentle sound of cups resting on saucers. She ordered tea because it was the cheapest warm thing available. She turned, and he was there. Not close, not far. Sitting alone at a table, hands around a cup he didn't drink from. Their eyes met again. No words. Only something like mutual recognition. Not of names, not of truths, but of presence. She felt it before he did, the air growing heavier, warmer, fragile. He inclined his head slightly. She did the same. It felt like the most delicate form of respect. She carried her tea to a table by the wall. He did not follow. He did not move. He stayed exactly where he was. But when she reached for her purse to pay, the cashier smiled faintly and shook his head. Already taken care of. Her gaze lifted to him. He didn't look back. That was the quiet rule of their borrowed warmth. It was given, never claimed. That night, wrapped in the blanket and wearing the gloves, Amara wrote one final line before closing her notebook. Whoever you are, your kindness feels like sunlight through glass. I hope the world is gentle to you, too. And far away, staring at city lights like stars that didn't belong to him, Armin felt something settle inside the hollow spaces of his life. It wasn't peace. It was warmth. Borrowed. The darkness began to feel fuller, heavier, as though it was no longer empty space, but something alive and breathing through the narrow streets. Winter deepened, and with it, the silence around Amara's borrowed warmth grew more fragile, less certain. Gifts still appeared. Firewood still found its way beside the stairwell. Medicine still arrived without being asked for. But now, warmth came with questions that did not rest. It happened on a late evening, soaked in mist. She had stopped at the tiny pharmacy on the corner, the one with the flickering red cross that buzzed like a tired insect. Eli's cough had returned in thin, restless waves, and the sound of it scraped lightly at the inside of her ribs. She stepped inside, her breath ghosting in the air, and gave the pharmacist Eli's name. The man frowned faintly, then turned to the shelves behind him. Already prepared, he said quietly, handing her the wrapped medicine. She hesitated. I didn't pay yet. He paused, then lowered his voice. You don't need to. She swallowed. Who? The pharmacist looked toward the back of the store, then away again, as if the answer had teeth. Better not to know, he said. She stepped out into the fog with the small paper bag in her hands and a strange, trembling feeling in her chest. Better not to know. The words clung to her skin like cold water. On the far end of the street, the black car rested silently, engine murmuring. Armin watched through the thin veil of mist. He had been careful. Always careful. But the world had a way of letting secrets slip through the cracks. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. The room felt too quiet. The blanket felt heavier. The borrowed warmth felt less like comfort and more like a question that refused to be ignored. She sat at the small table long after Eli drifted into broken, gentle sleep. Her notebook lay open before her. She didn't write. She listened instead to the building settling around her, to pipes whispering behind the walls, to footsteps of strangers up and down the narrow hall. Her thoughts kept circling the pharmacist's voice. Better not to know. Why wouldn't she want to know? The answer scared her. Because maybe the truth would destroy the softness. Days later, while cleaning tables at a small cafe to earn extra money, she heard it. 2 men sat near the back, their voices low, careless with danger. They weren't speaking to her. They weren't even aware of her presence. That was how names were lost and found. In careless moments. "You don't mess with him," one muttered, tapping ash from his cigarette. "Not Valès, not if you want to breathe tomorrow." The name landed inside her like a stone dropped into still water. Valès. She wiped the table slowly, her hands no longer feeling the cloth. The name echoed in her mind, strange and heavy and unfamiliar. She pretended not to listen, but her heart began to beat louder, faster, tighter. "People say he watches everything?" the other man whispered with a laugh that sounded false, like a ghost in a suit. A ghost in a suit. On her walk home that evening, the fog felt closer. The city felt narrower. She noticed shadows she had never noticed before. Not fear. Not yet. More like awareness that the world had more layers than she had allowed herself to see. She reached the stairwell and found another envelope resting beside the wall. Her fingers hovered over it for a long moment. Valès. She picked it up slowly as though it might move. Inside was money again, folded carefully. Touched by hands she imagined now, hands that belonged to a man with a name that lived in whispers. She did not feel gratitude first this time. She felt fear. Not big, panicked fear. Quiet fear, like a thin crack running through glass. That night, she whispered the name to herself. Valès? Across the city, Armand stood in his office and felt the shift before he could understand it. The phone on his desk displayed a missed call from one of his men. Mention of loose talk, of careless mouths. He crushed the cigarette in the glass ashtray without looking at it. The city was never perfectly silent. Names traveled, stories drifted. He walked to the window and rested his forehead briefly against the cool surface of the glass. He thought of the pharmacy, of the cafe, of her hands on tables, on coins, on gently folded blankets. He thought of her hearing his name. For the first time, a thought intruded that felt like danger. If she knows who I am, she will be afraid. And he knew that fear would change everything. The next time she saw him, she couldn't pretend she didn't feel it. It was outside the factory, late afternoon light breaking through clouds in pale, tired streaks. The wind tugged at her coat. The air tasted of metal and exhaust. The black car slowed beside the curb. The window lowered just slightly. She didn't step back. She looked at him. He looked the same. Calm. Controlled. But now the calm felt different. Now it felt like the surface of deep water. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" he asked, though he already knew. "For the warmth." A pause. She swallowed. "What should I call you?" The question hung between them like breath in cold air. For a moment, Armand considered lying. He was good at lies. Lies were safer. Lies were weapons. But something in her eyes stopped him. "Valès," he said softly. The name fell between them, real and unbroken. Her hands tightened on her bag. Not in anger, not in disgust, in understanding. The car moved away seconds later like nothing had happened. Like the world hadn't shifted. But inside her chest, something had cracked and something else had taken root. That night, she did not write. She stared at the blank page and whispered the name once more, tasting the danger in it. Not all shadows were empty. Some had names. And now she knew one. After that day, the air between them changed, as if the city itself had learned a new secret and did not know how to carry it gently. The name did not fade. It did not soften. It stayed in Amara's mind like a quiet pulse, beneath every thought, behind every breath. Valise. She found herself watching shadows more carefully, faces more closely, the spaces between footsteps. Her borrowed warmth began to feel heavier, as though it carried a weight she hadn't noticed before. The blanket was still warm. The gloves still fit her hands. The medicine still helped Eli sleep peacefully. But now every kindness had a shape behind it. A man. A name. A world she did not understand. He felt it too. Armin woke earlier than usual, long before the city pulled itself into motion. He stood by the window, watching the sky bruised with the color of fading night. His reflection stood tall and unmoved, but inside him something shifted restlessly, like a locked door being tested from the other side. She knew. That thought erased something simple from the way he breathed. He told himself he would step back. He told himself she had been a passing moment of softness, and that softness was a weakness he could not afford. His world was not built to hold someone who folded letters, who whispered into fogged windows, who counted coins like they were fragile prayers. But his feet moved toward her street again before logic could catch them. He stood across from her building that evening, shadows wrapping around his coat. The light in her window was on. Eli's small silhouette moved faintly behind the curtain before settling still. Amara sat on the bed with the blanket around her shoulders, the notebook open but untouched. She had tried to write. She truly had. But the words wouldn't come out clean anymore. Every sentence felt like it was walking too close to a cliff. A knock sounded at the door. Soft. Careful. Her breath caught. No one knocked here, not kindly, not gently. She opened it slowly. He stood there, not in shadow, not behind glass. In her narrow hallway, dimly lit, breathing, the same air. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly. She didn't argue. "I won't be long," he added. She stepped back enough to let him see the small room, the thin blanket, the quiet life folded into tight corners. He took it in without comment, without judgment. Not because it wasn't painful, but because he could feel how fragile it all was. "You've been helping us," she said. He didn't deny it. "You didn't tell me who you were." A pause. "I didn't want you afraid," he replied. She studied his face as if trying to read the parts that weren't visible. "You think knowing the truth would break me?" she asked. "No," he said truthfully. "I think it would put you in danger." The air tightened. Her hands curled into the hem of the blanket. She thought of whispered names in cafes, of shadows in stairwells, of men who spoke carefully when that name passed their lips. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. He looked at her without flinching. "Yes." The honesty startled her more than a lie would have. Silence stretched between them like thin glass. "I won't help you anymore," he said then, and the words felt torn from him. The lie tasted bitter the moment he spoke it. Her eyes lifted sharply. "Why?" "Because I shouldn't have started," he said. "Because I should never have watched you." He stopped himself before the next truth could escape. That he didn't know how to stop now. She stared at him, something fragile cracking in her chest. "You think warmth can be stolen back once it's been given?" she asked quietly. He had no answer. The lie was supposed to protect her. That was its purpose. He repeated it in his mind, wrapping himself in it like armor. "I won't help you anymore. I will not watch. I will not interfere." But he was still standing in her doorway, memorizing the way the light touched her face. "Well," she said slowly, her voice softer now, "if that's what you want." Her dignity remained, even then. especially then. He nodded once, stepped back, and turned away before he could take the lie apart and expose its truth. The stairwell swallowed his footsteps. The night closed around him. Amara closed the door. The room felt colder instantly, as if the small light had dimmed without actually changing. Eli shifted in his sleep, murmuring quietly, unaware of the quiet fracture moving through the air. She picked up her notebook with the slow hands. This time, she wrote. She wrote about a man who stood in silence and said goodbye with eyes that couldn't lie. She wrote about a kindness that claimed it was ending, but didn't feel finished. She wrote about protection that looked like distance. Outside, Armin walked down the street with long, controlled strides. He didn't look back. He didn't slow down. He repeated the lie again and again, forcing it to settle. I won't help her anymore. I won't go back. But when he reached the corner, he paused. Not long, just a breath. He glanced up toward the faint glow of her window, and in that glance, the lie began to crack. Days passed strangely after that. The stairwell was quieter. No blankets appeared, no envelopes slipped under doors, no scarves rested on factory chairs. The warmth disappeared the way it had arrived, without noise, without ceremony. Amara adapted. She always did. She used the last of the money carefully. She wrapped Eli in extra layers. She stayed longer hours at the factory. She sharpened herself inwardly, like glass preparing not to break. But nights were harder. Silence grew heavier. She found herself listening for footsteps that no longer came. Armin, meanwhile, began to feel the absence like a wound. Not dramatic, not loud, just a constant, steady ache. He sat in meetings and found himself staring at nothing. He gave orders and felt no satisfaction settle in his chest. The world of power and rule remained intact, but something vital felt missing, like warmth stolen by his own hand. The lie sat between them now. It protected no one. It hurt both. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between rain and breathing, both of them began to understand that distance was never stronger than truth. Not really. The city grew louder after the lie, as if silence itself had been offended. Amara felt it first in the way footsteps echoed differently in stairwells, sharper and closer than before. Doors slammed more often. Voices in the street carried a nervous edge. The air tasted more metallic, more restless, like a storm gathering behind glass that hadn't yet cracked. She tried to push it all away by working longer hours. The factory became her shelter and her prison. Cardboard folded beneath her hands in endless repetition. Glue dried on her fingertips again. The rhythm was familiar, reliable, safe. Or at least, it had been. She didn't tell Eli about the man. She didn't tell him about the warmth that had stopped coming. Some things were too complicated to be spoken aloud. Armin, meanwhile, had returned fully to his world, and his world welcomed him like sharp teeth closing around bone. Meetings grew darker, rooms filled with men who spoke softly, only when they were afraid. Deals crossed tables like loaded weapons disguised as paper. He listened. He commanded. He nodded. But part of him no longer sat in those rooms. Part of him was always standing in a narrow hallway that smelled like old paint and quiet resilience. He told himself that distance was safety. He told himself he had done the right thing. The city disagreed. The breaking point came on a night when rain fell in sheets, thick and blinding. Amara stood outside a small grocery store under a flickering sign, waiting for change from a tired cashier. The bag in her hands held only the smallest necessities: rice, a few vegetables, and medicine she had barely been able to afford. Two men argued loudly across the street. Their words were not sharp at first, only careless. Then the tone, shifted. Her senses prickled. She knew that tone. Danger had a sound to it. Low, electric, vibrating through the air. She tried to step away, to disappear back into the store, but it happened too quickly. A black car pulled up hard to the curb. The door opened. Men stepped out. Not strangers. Not hidden. Not quiet. Armand stepped into the rain. Without shadow, without distance, people nearby stilled, conversations died. Even the rain seemed to hesitate before touching him. One of the arguing men froze. The other stepped back without meaning to. His presence tore through the street like lightning forced into human shape. Amara saw him before he saw her. Her breath caught. He wasn't softened by tinted windows or distance now. His coat darkened under the rain, his hair untouched by disorder, his eyes calm in a way that did not belong to gentlemen. The men started speaking too quickly, too nervously. Apologies fell from their mouths without dignity. Armand spoke only once, low and controlled. Whatever he said, it was not loud, but it ended everything. The arguing men retreated, the car doors slammed, engines turned away. The street slowly began breathing again. He turned, and he saw her. She stood frozen, bag of groceries pressed against her chest as though it might break. The moment felt stretched thin, as if the world itself had stopped to watch them. She had never seen him like this, unhidden, unsoftened, unmistakable. This wasn't just a man with a heavy gaze and quiet words. This was a storm wearing human form. He stepped closer instinctively before remembering the lie, before remembering the distance he had promised her. "Go home," he said softly, almost a whisper against the sound of rain. Her voice trembled when she answered, "Is this what you wanted me to be afraid of?" He had no words. She looked at him, and for the first time she did not try to soften her expression. "This is who you are," she said. "Not accusation, not judgment, just truth." "Yes," he replied. Silence stretched again, but it didn't feel fragile this time. It felt broken. She stepped back slowly. Water soaked the hem of her coat. The bag in her hands trembled. "I can't unsee this," she said. "I never asked you to," he replied. She laughed softly then, a sound with no warmth. "You never asked me anything." The rain fell harder. People passed without looking. The world continued in its careless rhythm. But something inside her cracked cleanly. She turned away. Not in panic, not in haste. Just a slow, steady retreat that felt heavier than running. He did not follow. He did not reach for her. His hands remained at his sides, clenched loosely, as though holding invisible ropes he would not allow himself to pull. She walked all the way home in silence, her reflection flickering in wet pavement. The city felt larger, colder, more honest. Inside her room, she placed the groceries down carefully. Eli slept peacefully. She stared at the wall, at the faint cracks that ran like thin rivers across its surface. The silence finally broke when she sat down. Her breath caught. Her chest tightened. The notebook lay untouched on the table. She didn't open it. Across the city, Armand stood beneath an overhang outside a building he did not own, rain tracing long paths down his coat. He felt the weight of eyes that no longer trusted. He felt the absence of warmth he had taught himself to deny. The men who followed him waited at a distance, confused by the way he remained standing alone, unmoving, staring at nothing. His phone vibrated once with a message he didn't read. All he saw was the bag of groceries pressed against her chest. All he heard was her voice. I can't unsee this. He had protected her with a lie. Now the silence between them had broken louder than any truth. And somewhere inside both of them, in the quiet after broken sounds, something began to ache that could not be repaired with distance. Not anymore. The rain did not feel the same after that night. It no longer sounded like soft hands on glass or whispered prayers falling from the sky. Now it felt like exposure, like being seen too clearly by something too large to escape. Amara walked through it without an umbrella, without gloves, without the blanket folded around her shoulders. She let it soak her coat, her hair, her thoughts, because some part of her felt that staying dry would be dishonest. The warmth had left, not slowly, not gently. It had vanished in the shape of truth. She began to wake earlier, return home later, and speak less. The factory felt more like a wall she leaned against instead of a place that held her. The rhythm of folding cardboard turned into a kind of prayer she repeated only because she didn't know what else to believe in. Eli noticed the quiet. "You don't smile as much," he said once, his voice small and careful. She knelt by the bed and brushed his hair back gently. "I'm just tired," she whispered. That was not the whole truth. Nights became longer. The small bulb flickered more often. The cracked walls felt closer, as if they were slowly leaning inward. She wrapped Eli in extra layers and gave him the last of the medicine with a steady hand and a fractured heart. She did not look for envelopes anymore. She stopped expecting footsteps in stairwells. She peeled the borrowed warmth out of her life piece by piece, like removing stitching from a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Across the city, Armin began to feel strangely homeless. His penthouse was too large, the ceilings too high, the silence too clean. He walked from room to room and found nothing to touch that felt real enough. The leather chairs were colder than walls in winter. The glass windows reflected a man who felt suddenly unfamiliar. He stopped sending anything. He stopped driving by. He stopped pretending he was still near her. Instead, he drowned himself in work, in meetings that smelled of old smoke and danger, wrapped in cologne. Men talked. Deals moved. Power shifted hands like knives passed in darkness. But he left every room feeling emptier. The city that had once felt obedient began to feel like a stranger. One night, Amara was caught in a storm without shelter. She had been held late at the factory. A machine had failed. The supervisor had barked orders. The sky had grown dark without warning. When she stepped outside, the rain was already waiting. There was no bus stop nearby, no cafe, no familiar car idling in the distance like a silent guardian. Just water, cold, endless. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and started walking. Each step felt heavier, shoes filled with water, hair clung to her temples. Her breath came out in shaky clouds. The world narrowed to the sound of water hitting pavement and the slow rhythm of her own heart refusing to stop. She slipped once, caught herself on a rusted railing, laughed softly at the foolishness of it all. She reached the bridge near the river and stopped. The city lights blurred beyond the curtain of rain. The water below moved fast and dark, carrying pieces of the sky away without sound. She thought of the night she had cut her hair, of the scissors, of the envelope, of the milk, of tinted windows, of a name whispered in a cafe. Valise. She pressed her palm to her chest, not because it hurt, but because something inside her still remembered warmth and did not know what to do with the memory. Far away, in a car that moved too smoothly through wet streets, Armin stared without seeing. A deal had just been closed, apologies offered, threats traded, fear exchanged like currency. He should have felt satisfied. He felt nothing. The city passed like a blur of silver and shadow. "Turn around," he said suddenly. The driver hesitated. "Sir?" "Turn the car," he repeated, voice low. The man obeyed without question. He didn't know why he'd said it. He only knew the air had shifted, suddenly and violently, inside his chest. like a rope pulling tight around something he'd tried to forget. The car slowed near the bridge. Through the curtain of rain, he saw her. She stood still, soaked, fragile, stubbornly upright. His hand tightened against the door without him noticing. He did not step out. He did not call her name. He was a man of shadows. He had promised distance. He had built walls high enough that no softness should have reached him. And yet, he felt it. The pull. The impossible, unacceptable pull. She turned slightly as though she felt something, though she had no reason to. Their eyes met again through rain instead of glass. This time, the distance felt cruel. He lifted his hand slightly. Not a wave, not a signal, just a movement. She didn't respond. She didn't dignity him with reaction. She simply turned away and walked on, slowly disappearing into the sheets of rain. He did not follow. He did not stop her. The car pulled away again, tires whispering against wet road. Both of them carried the weight of that moment into the night. Back in her small room, Amara peeled off her wet coat, pressed it over the sink, and sat on the edge of the bed. Eli slept softly, unaware of storms outside and storms within. She wrapped her arms around herself. The room felt colder than it should have been. Far across the city, Armand stood at the window, rain sliding down glass in thin, trembling trails. He imagined her standing on the bridge, soaked, unshielded, unprotected. He felt something break quietly. Rain without shelter was not just water. It was what happened when two hearts stood exposed, too proud to reach, too wounded to speak, and too alive to stop feeling. And as the storm softened into whispers against roofs and roads, both of them lay awake beneath separate ceilings, carrying the same ache without knowing if it would ever stop. The silence between them grew deeper and more dangerous. The city did not forgive softness. It only noticed it. Armand learned that on a night when the air inside a private room felt heavier than smoke, and the walls seemed to lean in to listen. A long wooden table lay at the center, polished so perfectly that reflections looked like ghosts trapped beneath its surface. Around it sat men whose eyes had forgotten kindness and whose hands were too familiar with silence after screams. They did not speak his name out loud. They didn't need to. "You've been distracted," one of them said, voice quiet but dangerous. Armand did not deny it. He had learned long ago that denial was a weaker sin than pride. "What we build requires sharp edges," another added, fingers tapping slowly against the table. "Soft hands can't hold sharp truths." Their words didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how little he cared. He thought of a girl standing on a bridge in the rain, refusing to look back. He thought of a broken silence. He thought of warmth folded into a blanket that had never belonged in a world like his. That night, he paid for his silence with more than words. A deal was forced, a territory tightened, a message sent. Not to her, never to her, but to the world that surrounded him. He showed them the part of him that listened only to fear, only to power, only to bloodless cold. The price of softness was brutality. He paid it without hesitation. Across the city, Amara felt other kinds of costs. Work grew thinner, hours shorter. The factory manager's eyes lingered too long, his voice sharper than before. The city's kindness had never been generous, but now it felt deliberately scarce. Coins became lighter in her palm. Food grew simpler. The room felt smaller. She sold small things quietly. An old ring that had once been her mother's. A scarf she'd owned since childhood. Each item left her hands like a goodbye she wasn't allowed to mourn. She did not look for warmth anymore. She learned to become it for herself. Eli coughed more some nights, and she held him without shaking, without breaking, without letting the fear show. She learned that softness had a cost too, but she never stopped choosing it. She just paid for it in silence. One gray morning, she noticed the machine operator whispering to another woman at the factory, glancing toward her and then away. The looks were not cruel. Not kind either, just cautious. Fear traveled quietly. She didn't know what shape it had taken, only that it had reached her. Armand, meanwhile, began to notice the cost of his softness spreading. Men who had once brought him information without question started hesitating before they spoke. Invitations to silent meetings arrived later. Messages required more effort to summon. They didn't say it out loud. They never would. But they were measuring him, and he knew it. He had stepped too close to something human, and humanity, in his world, was expensive. Late one night, he stood alone in an empty room where the only sound was the faint hum of city breath outside tall windows. He poured a drink, stared at it, and set it down untouched. He thought of what he'd earned: power, control, silence. He thought of what he'd risked: a girl with damp hair, a warm blanket, a paper bag of milk. The contrast felt almost cruel. He tightened his hand into a fist against the glass table beside him. This is the price, he told himself. This is what softness costs. Amara, at the same time, stood in a narrow market street, fingers wrapped around a small purse that now felt too light. The sky hung low. Vendors called out in tired voices. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and things that had once been fresh. She hesitated before buying fruit. She put it back. She bought rice instead. She counted the coins twice before handing them over. As she walked away, a van slowed beside her. The door opened a fraction. Her heart tightened. Not fear? Recognition? She saw him before he said anything. "Get in," he said quietly, not as an order, but as something carefully offered. She looked at him. Her mind searched for anger, for accusation, for blame. None came, only exhaustion. "I'm not cold," she said. He nodded once. "I know." The van didn't move. People passed. Life continued. "I know it costs you," she said, her voice low. He hesitated. "I never meant for it to," he replied. She stepped one pace closer. "You don't get to choose what people pay for kindness," she said. "You just choose whether you're kind." Her words stayed with him like a scar. She stepped back. "I won't get in," she said, simply. He did not ask why. She walked away. Not like someone running. Like someone crossing a line she could no longer pretend she didn't see. That night, he broke something. Not outside. Inside. He ordered a shift, a retreat, a tightening of boundaries. He closed doors that had been slightly open. He sent messages that reminded people who he had once been before warmth came and made him human. The world corrected itself around him, but it felt hollow. Amara wrapped Eli in the blanket that had once been left at her door. It was fraying now at the edges, thinner, more worn. But it was still warm. Borrowed warmth did not disappear. It changed shape. She sat by the window, watching the slow drift of fog between buildings. The city lights flickered like tired stars. She thought of the bridge, of the car, of the eyes that had watched her without pity, of a man paying for softness in ways she could not see. She touched the glass lightly, not for him, not for herself, just for the quiet understanding that some warmth, once felt, never truly leaves. Across the city, Armand stood with his back to massive windows and whispered to no one. Voice barely more than breath. "This is what it costs." The city did not answer. The night did not soften. And somewhere between sharp edges and fragile hearts, the price of softness was paid in ways neither of them could count. But both of them could feel. The air grew thin with unsaid words. Amara felt it in the way the mornings no longer held any soft hesitation. She woke before the pale light touched the cracked ceiling, before the pipes stirred behind the walls. Her body moved on instinct now. Wash, heat water, count coins, fold blankets. Everything happened in a quiet order that did not ask for hope. Eli slept longer these days. His breathing was steadier, gentler. That, at least, remained a small mercy. She packed her bag with careful precision. Work clothes, a piece of bread, the last bit of medicine. She no longer looked at the place in the room where envelopes had once appeared. That space had turned into a part of the wall for her. Invisible, neutral, empty. But some nights she still dreamed. She dreamed of rain, of scissors biting through her hair, of a warm paper bag pressed against her palms, of eyes behind tinted glass. She never told anyone. Not Eli. Not herself. Across the city, Armand's world continued to close. Rooms became colder, voices became sharper. Men began speaking in half sentences and sideways glances. He walked through hallways where respect still lived, but warmth had died quietly in the corners. He did not complain. He did not speak of it. He had chosen silence, and silence had answered him with a kind of cruelty that looked like order. One night, he stood alone in a room filled with maps and quiet threats disguised as ink. A glass sat untouched in his hand. He watched the city through thick windows and wondered when everything had started to look like memory instead of life. He remembered the first time he saw her hair fall to the floor. He remembered the air inside the cafe. He remembered the way she'd said his name without fear. Valès. The sound of it in her voice had never felt like a curse. That was the problem. Amara took a longer route home that week. Not because she needed to, but because something inside her wanted to avoid familiar roads, familiar corners, familiar pieces of memory that pressed too hard against her chest. The sky stayed gray. The wind tasted of old rain and distant smoke. She walked past windows of warm cafes and didn't step inside. Warmth felt like a language she used to speak. On the bridge, she stopped again. Not because the water called her, but because stillness felt necessary. The river moved restlessly below, dark and folded, carrying pieces of the sky with it. She rested her palms on the cold railing and let her breath slow. Somewhere, far behind her, tires rolled softly over wet stone. She did not turn. She felt him before she heard him. His presence was strange like that. No sound, just a shift in the air. "I won't disturb you," he said quietly. She closed her eyes briefly. "I know," she replied. They stood side by side without touching. The space between them felt heavy, full of things that had never found their voice. "You shouldn't come here," she said. "I know. You shouldn't follow me." "I don't." The lie was thin. She exhaled slowly. He looked at the water, not at her. "You deserve quiet," he said. "You deserve quiet, too," she answered, surprised by the truth of it. Silence stretched long and tender. "I'm leaving this part of the city soon," she said. He felt it like a blade through something soft. Not because she owed him anything, not because he had any right to stay, but because endings had a way of arriving without ceremony. "Good," he said, though it tasted like dust. She nodded. The wind moved through her short hair. They did not touch. He did not step closer. She did not ask him to stay. Goodbyes did not always need to be spoken. Sometimes they lived in shared silence. That night, she packed more than she had packed before. Fewer clothes, fewer objects, more resolve. She folded the blanket one last time and placed it carefully beside Eli. She smoothed the edges like she was tucking in a memory. Her notebook lay open on the small table, pages filled with things she had never dared to say out loud. She read them slowly. Then, one by one, she tore them out. Not in anger, Not in rejection, in release. The last page stayed. She folded it gently. At the same hour, Armand unlocked the drawer he had not opened in months. He removed the letter he had never sent. He read it. Rain, hands, silence. Things he had never thought a man like him would put to paper. He did not tear it. He folded it again, carefully. But this time, he did not lock it away. He left it on the table. The morning came quietly. Amara walked through her room one last time before leaving for work, or something that might become new work. She touched the doorframe, the small table, the chair that had held too much quiet. She kissed Eli's forehead as he slept. Then she stepped out. Across the city, Armand stood on a rooftop, wind pressing against his coat. He watched the city breathe and tried to feel like he still belonged to it. Somewhere beneath him, she walked through streets, carrying nothing except her own steadiness. They did not meet again that day. They did not speak. Their goodbyes lived in the space between them, soft and unbroken, like a whisper moving through rain. And in the quiet after those unwritten words, both of them felt the same ache, not sharp, not loud, just endless. Fire arrived without warning. It wasn't the roar of open flames that reached Amara first. It was the smell, sharp, chemical, wrong. She woke to it before dawn, her body stiff with the instinct of someone who had learned to survive by listening to small changes in air. Smoke crawled along the ceiling like a slow, poisonous river. For one suspended heartbeat, she couldn't move. Then Eli coughed, a thin, panic sound, and her body remembered how to live. She threw the blanket off him, wrapped it around his shoulders, and pulled him to his feet. The small room felt tighter, hotter, louder. The door handle burned her palm when she touched it. She didn't scream. She moved. The stairwell was chaos, shadows running, feet pounding, voices breaking into fear. Someone shouted that it was electrical. Someone else shouted that it wasn't. Nobody knew. Everybody ran. She carried Eli wrapped against her chest and tasted smoke instead of air. Outside, the cold hit them like a slap. The building behind them coughed fire from its windows, orange and hungry. People gathered in small, shocked clusters, hugging themselves, whispering prayers without sound. Amara stood barefoot on wet pavement, holding Eli, watching the place that had held every piece of her life begin to turn into ash. Across the city, Armand felt it like a knife under his ribs. He was in a silent conference room when the phone vibrated across the table. He didn't look at the screen at first. He didn't need to. Something in him had already begun to tear. A building, a street, a report spoken too quickly. His chair scraped sharply across the floor. For once, no one tried to stop him. By the time he arrived, the smell of smoke had already written itself into the air. Fire engines flashed red against blackened walls. Voices drifted, crying, panic. Whispers of cause that meant nothing in the face of loss. He saw her immediately, not because she stood out, but because he knew her presence the way one knows the sound of their own heartbeat. She stood wrapped in a thin coat someone had placed over her shoulders. Eli slept against her, exhausted, safe. Her face was calm, too calm. He didn't approach at first. He stayed among the shadows of responders and strangers, watching the only safe distance he believed he deserved. This was my world, he thought. This was what I pulled you toward. He didn't know yet how. He would. By morning. They said it could have been wires. They said it could have been old, cracked walls. They said it could have been anything. But Armand knew how his world worked, and someone had made a call. Amara sat on the curb while dawn painted the sky faintly, pale. She held a cup of cheap tea between shaking hands. Eli leaned against her side, sleeping in the fragile way of children who dream even when they shouldn't. Everything smelled like loss. She did not cry. She did not shake. She did not ask why. Ash coated the ends of her fingers like a thin grey reminder. A man sat beside her. Not Harmon. A stranger with tired eyes and a calm voice. Someone who didn't quite belong to the world of fire engines and charity blankets. "You should be careful," he said quietly. She looked at him blankly. "There are some people who don't like softness," he added. Her heart tightened. "Someone made this happen," she said. He didn't confirm it. She didn't need him to. Later that day, she stood in front of what remained of her home. Blackened door. Broken window. The smell of burned wood and damp smoke clinging to the air as if it had no intention of leaving. And then she saw him. He didn't hide this time. He stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, eyes never leaving her. She crossed the road without hesitation, stopped a few steps away. The world narrowed again, just the two of them and the ache in the space between. "Did you know?" she asked softly. "No," he replied instantly. That they both knew was true. For the first time, she heard the crack in his voice. "Would this have happened if I had never met you?" she asked. He hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Someone did this because of you," she said. "Yes." He didn't lie. He couldn't. She stared at him, not with anger, not with blame, with understanding that burned deeper than either. "You tried to protect me by leaving," she said. "Yes." "You tried to protect me by lying." "Yes." Her hands trembled. Eli shifted under her arm. "And still," she whispered, "your world found me." He had no defense. Silence filled the street. She laughed softly. Not with joy, not with bitterness, but with something like quiet grief. "All this time," she said, "I thought borrowed warmth was a miracle." He lowered his head slightly. "And now I know," she continued, "it was taken from a fire." Her words did not accuse. They illuminated. Then he did something he had never done before. He told the truth, not a version, not a softened story. The truth. He told her about his world in fragments, not names, not places, but shapes of violence and power. He told her he had tried to make something gentle from something cruel. He told her he had never meant for her to be touched by it. "I didn't deserve to stand near you," he said. She studied him. "You never stood near me," she replied. "You stood behind." He flinched. "Someone tried to send me a message," he said quietly. "And now they've sent it." She exhaled slowly. The sirens had stopped. Only ash remained. She looked back at the building one last time. Then at him. "And now?" she asked. He met her eyes fully. "Now I burn what needs to be burned," he said. "And I never let the ashes touch you again." She nodded once. Not agreement. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. That night, she and Eli found a temporary place to sleep. A small room offered by strangers with tired kindness. The walls were unfamiliar. The blankets smelled faintly of soap and fear. She lay awake long after Eli slept. She stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how something as soft as warmth could hide inside a fire. Across the city, Armand stood in a corridor, lit by cold fluorescent lights. Men watched him carefully. They had seen the shift. Softness had ended. Something darker had taken its place. He gave orders without raising his voice. He moved pieces without breaking stride. Something had been touched. Something had been threatened. And somewhere, inside the smoke of a burned building and the silence of a girl who did not cry, the truth settled into ash. Not destroyed, just exposed and waiting. The temporary room smelled like soap and old fear, like kindness worn thin by too many stories. Amara lay awake beneath a blanket borrowed from strangers, listening to Eli's steady breathing and the distant hum of a city that never fully slept. The events of the past day moved in slow, relentless waves behind her eyes. Smoke in her throat, ash on her fingers, and the quiet honesty in a man's voice when he admitted destruction had his name written on it. She had not cried. She did not know if she would. Outside, the night crept through narrow streets, tracing paths between windows and shadows. Somewhere between streetlights and silence, Armin moved through halls that echoed. His footsteps were quiet, but his presence was not. The building he entered was older than guilt. Concrete walls, exposed beams, air thick with the scent of oil and metal. Men waited for him without leaning, without shifting. They had learned long ago that when he walked into a room this silent, something in the foundation of their world was about to crack. He did not sit. He did not shout. He simply spoke. A name, a territory, a betrayal. A small piece of information sharpened into something that cut. He had never moved with this particular kind of precision before. Not cold, not cruel, focused, clean. Every word designed not to destroy, but to end. By dawn, the city would feel quieter in a way it would never be able to explain. Amara woke to a thin line of morning light crawling across unfamiliar walls. For a few heartbeats, she didn't remember where she was. Then she felt the stiffness in her shoulders. Then she smelled faint smoke still clinging to her coat. Reality returned without mercy. Eli stirred and blinked at her. "Are we going home?" he whispered. She brushed his hair back gently. "Not yet," she said, "but we're safe." She hoped it was true. The air outside was cold and washed clean by a late, tired rain. They walked slowly through the street, her hand wrapped around his. Her mind wrapped around questions she did not want to say out loud. She found him where she somehow expected him to be. Not in shadow, not in glass. Standing at the edge of a small, empty garden that belonged to no one. Bare trees twisted above like hands that had once tried to reach heaven. The ground was wet. The air carried the scent of soil and old leaves. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly when he saw her. "I know," she answered. She sent Eli ahead with a soft squeeze of his hand and a promise to follow. The boy obeyed, trusting without questions, a kind of softness she never wanted the world to steal from him. She faced Armin fully. "You're going to fix this," she said. "I already started." A small silence sat between them. "And after?" she asked. He hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. "There is no after," he said. "Not for me." She studied his face, a face shaped by storms that had never found a place to fall. "You can't live in fire forever," she said. "I've never lived anywhere else." Wind moved through the bare branches. "You told me you would burn what needs to be burned," she said. "Yes. And when there's nothing left?" A beat of quiet. "I disappear," he said, simply. It was not drama. It was not a threat. It was a plan. Her chest tightened. "That's not a life," she whispered. "It's the only safe one." She stepped closer, not touching, just closer. "And where does that leave us?" she asked. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Silence stretched like a thin red line. "Say it," she said softly. "I can't stay near you," he said. "Not after this. Not after knowing they reached you. I won't let it happen again." Her hands curled into fists. "And if I choose to stand close anyway?" she asked. He left the question hanging in the air, unspoken. "You don't get to decide alone," she said, voice steadier now. "Not anymore." He looked at her like she was a storm he had never learned how to survive. "I can't pull you into this again," he said. "You already did," she replied. and I'm still standing. She took another small step. This is not about fear, she went on. This is about choice, yours and mine. His eyes darkened. You don't know what it costs. You don't know what it costs to lose your home in one night, she said quietly. To hold a child and not know where to take him. To feel warmth and have it ripped away. Her voice did not break. Her heart did. I'm not asking you to be gentle, she continued. I'm asking you to be honest. The wind rose slightly. A leaf dragged itself across wet earth. He exhaled slowly like a man stepping toward the edge of something he had spent his life avoiding. If I choose you, he said, the words heavy as iron, everything changes. She nodded. Everything already has. Silence returned, but changed in shape. You won't be safe, he said. I was never safe, she answered. I will make enemies, he said. You already have. His jaw tightened. This will bleed, he said. She held his gaze. Then let it bleed, she replied. That was the moment. The one that hurt. The one that stayed. The choice that bled was not loud. It was not a grand promise carved into stone. It was quieter and more terrifying. Stay out of the shadows, she said, at least with me. He hesitated, long enough to feel like time had stopped breathing. Then he nodded. Not agreement, not surrender. Commitment. That afternoon he visited a place he had never brought anyone before. A thin, bare apartment overlooking a narrow street. Not grand, not protected, not wrapped in glass and steel. A place with windows you could open and walls you could touch. A life that felt real. This is as close as I can bring you, he said. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stepped inside. That night she sat by the window while Eli slept in the next room. The street below breathed, slow and quiet. Footsteps passed. Conversations drifted. Somewhere a dog barked once. Behind her, Armand stood in the doorway. Not touching, not speaking, just present. The city felt different from this height. More human, more fragile. He rested one hand against the wall as though touching something solid reminded him he was still alive. You could leave, he said softly. I know, she replied. You should? I won't. He looked at her as though memorizing the shape of her courage. This will hurt, he said again. She looked back, eyes steady. I've lived through worse than pain, she said. I've lived through nothing. Silence again. Closer now. Warmer. Outside, the wind moved through wires and empty branches. Inside, two lives stood trembling on the edge of something neither of them had planned. And in the quiet, fragile space between them, the choice that bled did not scream. It only whispered. Morning entered the small apartment gently. Not like a blade, but like a whisper. Pale light moved across the walls, touching everything without asking permission. The worn table, the thin curtains, the floor that creaked softly beneath quiet footsteps. The air felt different here. Not safer, not softer, but honest. Amara woke before Eli did. She sat by the window, chin resting quietly against the glass, watching the slow, ordinary life of the street below. A woman sweeping dust from a doorstep. A man unlocking a small shop. A stray cat weaving between shadows as though it had somewhere to be. This place did not smell like her burned home. It smelled like beginnings she didn't trust yet. Behind her, Armand moved without sound. He had not slept. Not truly. He had spent most of the night standing near the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes open, listening to the sound of breathing that was not his. The soft rhythm of Eli's sleep. The quieter rhythm of Amara's thoughts drifting like fog through the room. He poured water into 2 chipped cups and placed one near her hand. Thank you, she said, without turning. No explanation lived in that gratitude, just truth. Eli awoke to a quieter morning than any he had known. He sat up slowly, confused at first, then strangely calm. He trusted Amara's presence more than walls. He trusted warmth more than memory. "Is this our new place?" he asked. "For now," she answered, smoothing his hair back. He nodded. That was enough. The city breathed differently when they stepped outside together. The sky was soft, washed clean by memory of rain. The air tasted faintly of dust and newness. People passed them without knowing that something fragile and dangerous had just been born between three hearts that had lived too much too early. They walked through a quiet market street. Vendors called out lazily. Fruit shimmered in small wooden crates. The world continued without pausing. For the moment things had changed, Arman walked slightly behind them. Not hiding, not leading, just there. He noticed the way she slowed her steps when Eli fell slightly behind. The way she listened before speaking. The way her eyes found small details in the world, like she was trying to collect pieces of it before it disappeared again. He began to understand the way she moved through pain, silently, gracefully, without demand. She bought a small bag of fruit with careful coins. He did not offer his wallet. She did not ask. This mattered. They both understood. Later, in a quiet part of a small park that smelled of cold earth and thin grass, she sat on a worn wooden bench while Eli wandered a few steps away, fascinated by fallen leaves. "You could make this easier," she said without looking at him. He sat beside her, but not too close. "I don't want to make it false," he replied. That answer surprised her. "You're learning," she said. "I am trying," he answered. They both watched Eli for a moment, the way he crouched down, inspecting something as small as a fallen leaf with the seriousness of a scientist. "He trusts you," Arman said softly. "He trusts the quiet," she replied. "Not you." He nodded. He deserved no more. The afternoon softened. Light filtered through bare branches, fell on their faces, warmed nothing but air itself. Silence moved between them, but this time it did not hurt. This time it felt like room to breathe. Later, back in the apartment, Eli slept again, exhausted by the simplicity of safety. Amara stood near the window, looking out as the sky grew pale gold. The city wore gentler colors at this hour. Sounds softened. Voices lost their edges. Arman stood a few steps behind her, not touching, always careful. "You don't have to stand so far," she said quietly. "I do," he replied. "Not defensiveness, not fear. Respect." She turned slightly, the light framing her face in thin gold. "You don't always have to be made of glass," she said. He looked at her. For the first time, he allowed the quiet to reach deeper. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted. She took one slow step closer. Not a bridge, not a promise, just proximity. The air shifted. The room felt smaller and larger all at once. "I don't want you to be softer for the world," she said. "Only for this room." His breath caught in a way he couldn't hide. "That's more dangerous," he said. She nodded. "I know." Silence gathered between them again, but different. Warm, alive, hearable. Outside, a distant sound of children's laughter rose and fell with the wind. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, someone closed a door. Inside, the shadows touched the same wall without touching each other. That night, when the light turned soft and Eli slept with a faint smile on his face, something shifted. Arman placed a blanket carefully over the back of a chair. Amara moved it gently to the bed. Their hands brushed, only for a heartbeat. But it was real. No fire, no rain, no apologies. Just quiet light. Later, standing in the hallway, he spoke without turning around. If you ever want to leave. I won't, she said. He nodded. He did not ask. In the quiet of that small apartment, with the city breathing gently through thin walls and tired windows, something new existed. It wasn't safety. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't a finished story. It was simply this. Two wounded people sitting in the same light, not hiding from it, not running from it, just allowing it to exist. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like something broken. It felt like something whole. Time did not heal everything, but it softened the sharpest edges. The small apartment remained just that. Small, imperfect, honest. The curtains caught more light now. The floor knew the sound of gentler footsteps. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in but holding still, like quiet witnesses to something fragile that had decided to live. Amara learned the rhythm of this new life slowly, not with excitement, not with dreams too large to carry, with small choices. Warm water in the morning, fresh air through an open window, Eli's laughter, which had returned in tiny bursts like sunlight through cracks in old stone. Armand did not leave. He also did not become a miracle. He remained sharp at the edges, quiet, watchful. But he began slowly to sit instead of stand, to breathe instead of listen, to exist in rooms instead of guarding their corners. The world outside did not soften. But inside, something had changed shape. One evening, months later, rain returned, not as a storm, not as danger, but as a soft silver curtain across the city. The kind of rain that fell straight down, cleaning dust from windows and laying gentle trails on tired pavement. Amara stood at the small stove, heating water for tea. Eli sat at the table, swinging his legs as he tried to copy small letters in a worn book she had found at a street stall. "Mara," he said, pencil tucked strangely between small fingers. "Is the moon always this big?" She looked out the window. The moon hung low and round, pale gold in the dark sky. It looked close enough to touch if someone believed hard enough. "Sometimes," she said. "Only when it has something to watch." He nodded, satisfied with that answer. Armand stood by the window, hands resting against the sill. He said nothing. He rarely did when he felt something fully. He watched her move without rushing, watched the small carefulness in the way she poured water, the softness that did not require permission. Later, after Eli slept, she carried 2 cups to the small table by the window, one for herself, one placed quietly beside him. Milk steamed faintly in chipped porcelain. She hadn't bought it because she had to. She had bought it because she wanted to. They sat without speaking. The city below whispered through thin streets. A car passed. A voice drifted. Somewhere, distant music breathed through an open window. "You remember the first time I held a cup of milk?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "I never thought something so small could feel so heavy," she said. He looked at the white surface of the drink. "You didn't ask where it came from," he said. "I didn't want to break the miracle," she answered. Silence wrapped around them like a familiar shawl. Outside, rain softened the edges of everything. "I thought strength meant never needing," she said after a while. "Now I think it's knowing when to accept." He watched the moon. "I thought survival meant never feeling," he said. "Now I know it just meant I was alone." They did not touch. They did not need to. Their hands rested nearby on the table, steady, real, not trembling. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded like a lonely animal in the dark. Eli stirred briefly in his sleep, then sighed and turned over. And for a moment, the world felt quiet in a way that did not hurt. Years passed like this, not loud, not dramatic, but real. The apartment grew warmer, The curtains faded with sun. The walls slowly gathered stories instead of fear. Eli grew taller, louder, smarter. He asked fewer questions and gave more smiles. Amara found work not just to survive, but to live. She folded less cardboard. She folded more dreams into careful, realistic shapes. Arman walked more slowly through the streets. He chose his words more carefully. He listened to silence not as a threat, but as a friend. The city still knew his name, but it learned not to own him. And one night, long after the scars had turned into memories instead of wounds, Amara stood alone at the window. Moonlight spilled quietly across the floor. She ran her fingers through her now longer hair, grown back slowly, naturally, patiently. Hair that had once been cut away for something as simple and sacred as milk. She remembered the scissors, the rain, the envelope, the quiet eyes behind glass. Footsteps sounded softly behind her. He did not need to ask permission. He never did here. He stood beside her, close enough to share warmth, but not intending to take anything that wasn't offered. "Is the moon watching again?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "It always is." He leaned his shoulder lightly against the wall. His presence felt less like shadow now, more like structure. "You sold your hair for milk," he said, as if the words still surprised him. "I did," she replied. "And I watched," he said. "Yes." He hesitated, and for once he let emotion move through his voice without trimming its edges. "I've wondered," he said, "what would have happened if I had looked away." She turned to him. Her eyes were not sad. They were not afraid. They were alive. "Then," she said softly, "I would still have survived." The honesty in that did not hurt him. It healed something. She reached for the cup on the table, poured milk slowly, and held it up toward the light. "You didn't save me," she said. "I know," he replied. "You saw me," she continued, "and that changed something." He looked at the moon. "And you let me belong to something real," he said. The rain started again, faintly, gently. Outside, the city sighed. Inside, the small apartment held steady. No fires, no broken glass, no whispers of danger. Just milk warming in porcelain and moonlight resting on tired floors. Later that night, as Eli slept and the rain softened into nothing, they sat side by side without speaking, hands finally resting close enough that their fingers touched. No shock, no fear, just warmth, borrowed and then earned. And somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, where rain turned to memory and scars turned to stars, love did not arrive loudly. It returned, soft, certain, real. And in the gentle silver stillness of milk and moonlight, two lives that had once collided in darkness began, at last, to breathe in peace.